Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage just as the autumn light was beginning to fade, casting the village in shades of amber and grey. She carried with her a small parcel of homemade biscuits, ostensibly for the vicar's wife, though in reality she had come to observe and to listen, two activities she had perfected over the course of a long life. The drawing-room was already occupied by several concerned villagers, all ostensibly gathered to discuss the tragedy, but actually assembled to speculate about the murder with the particular fervour that violence brings to quiet places. Detective Inspector Graves was also present, a tall man with grey eyes that missed very little, and he regarded Miss Marple's arrival with that mixture of polite dismissal and subtle interest that police officers often showed toward elderly women, whom they tended to underestimate entirely. Eleanor Whitmore was there as well, looking slightly triumphant in the way of people who have discovered something significant, and beside her sat David Thornbury, the young man whom Mrs. Danvers had mentioned, now 32 years old and visibly uncomfortable in the presence of the detective. David worked as an accountant in the neighbouring town of Ashford, a position he had taken after leaving Little Ashford some years earlier, and his presence in the village had become rather rare since the business with the missing bank funds had clouded his reputation. Inspector Graves was in the midst of explaining the preliminary findings from the pathologist when Miss Marple settled herself into a chair near the window, her knitting needles producing a soft, rhythmic clicking sound that seemed to soothe rather than irritate those around her. Blackwell, it appeared, had been killed between 7 and 9 o'clock in the evening, struck with what the inspector suspected was a heavy walking stick or perhaps a cudgel. The murder was not particularly sophisticated. There were no signs of elaborate planning, merely passion and violence and the sort of desperation that comes when someone has acted without thinking through the consequences. The inspector had been interviewing various residents about their movements on the previous evening, and while several people had noted seeing Blackwell near the bank around closing time, no one had seen him in Meadow Lane or observed anything out of the ordinary in that direction. What was becoming increasingly clear, however, was that Thomas Blackwell had accumulated a remarkable number of enemies during his tenure at the bank. His ex-wife Margaret, who now lived in the neighbouring village, had been forced to leave him after discovering that he had been conducting an affair with his secretary, a young woman named Catherine Wells. Catherine had subsequently left Ashford under rather mysterious circumstances 3 months ago, and no one seemed to know precisely where she had gone or what had become of her. Then there was the matter of David Thornbury, whose youthful indiscretion with the bank's petty cash had been discovered by Blackwell, and who had barely escaped criminal prosecution through the intervention of his father, an old friend of the bank's board chairman. And there was also Margaret's current husband, a man named Robert Sinclair, who had apparently had a rather heated confrontation with Blackwell at the public house some weeks earlier, according to testimony from the landlord. Miss Marple listened to all of this with an expression of mild interest, occasionally asking a gentle question about some small detail. What had Blackwell been wearing precisely, and had anyone noticed whether he habitually walked in Meadow Lane? And was it true that he had recently dismissed one of the bank's longest-serving employees? Her question seemed inconsequential, the sort of thing an elderly woman might wonder about out of simple curiosity, but each one elicited responses that added another thread to the tapestry of information. The inspector, Miss Marple noted, was becoming increasingly convinced that David Thornbury was the most likely suspect. The young man had motive, the lingering shame of the accusation, and opportunity, having admitted that he had been in the village on the evening of the murder, visiting his elderly mother. The inspector began focusing his questions upon David with increasing intensity, noting the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke, the way his eyes did not quite meet the inspector's gaze directly. By the time evening had fully fallen and the inspector had concluded his initial interviews, the atmosphere in the drawing-room had shifted perceptibly, a kind of consensus forming among the assembled villagers that David Thornbury, damaged and desperate and burdened by his past, had finally snapped under the weight of Blackwell's continued contempt. Eleanor Whitmore had actually reached across and patted David's arm in a gesture that was meant to be sympathetic but seemed instead to confirm everyone's unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple, still clicking away with her knitting needles, observed that it was interesting how quickly people arrived at conclusions, particularly when those conclusions confirmed what they already believed about a person. The remark was directed at no one in particular, and made in such a quiet voice that most of those present barely registered it. But Inspector Graves, on his way toward the door, paused and looked back at the elderly woman with a slight frown, as though something she had said had caught at his attention in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The inspector was not a man prone to second-guessing himself, but something in Miss Marple's tone suggests that she might be aware of something that he was not. However, the evidence seemed clear enough, and in the morning arrangements would be made to take David Thornbury in for formal questioning. The village settled into that particular state of unsettled satisfaction that comes when a crime has been solved, or at least when everyone believes it has been solved, and the comfortable certainties of daily life can resume their normal rhythms. The following morning brought with it a clarity that seemed almost cruel in its brightness, as though the sun itself had decided to illuminate every shadow and expose every hidden thing. David Thornbury was taken from his mother's house at 8:30, his wrists encircled by the gentle but firm grip of P.C. Mitchell, while neighbors watched from behind lace curtains and pretended not to observe. The village, having had its suspicions confirmed by this very public arrest, settled into the comfortable rhythms of gossiping about the crime with the confidence of people who believed the matter was essentially resolved. Yet Miss Marple, who had spent the previous evening organizing her knitting wool by color and considering the particular texture of human behavior, found herself unable to share in this general satisfaction. She sat in her small cottage on the outskirts of the village, drinking her morning tea and reading through the newspaper account of the crime with the careful attention of someone searching for something that others had overlooked. The article mentioned that Blackwell's cottage had been searched and that certain financial documents had been discovered, documents that suggested irregularities in the bank's accounts dating back several years. It also noted that Blackwell had been found with a substantial sum of cash in his pocket, nearly £200, an amount that seemed excessive for a simple evening constitutional. Miss Marple set down her newspaper and allowed her mind to wander through the landscape of what she had observed, cataloguing the small inconsistencies that had caught her attention during the previous evening's conversations. Eleanor Whitmore, for instance, had seemed not merely distressed by the murder, but oddly energized by it, the way some people become when they have played a role, however minor, in something significant. David Thornbury's hands had trembled, yes, but they had trembled in the way of someone who was frightened of being blamed for something, not necessarily the way of someone who had actually committed a crime. And Inspector Graves, methodical and competent though he was, had allowed his preconceptions about David's character to guide his investigation in a particular direction, the way experienced policemen sometimes do when they believe they have found a satisfactory solution. Around mid-morning, Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Danvers, who arrived with barely concealed excitement and a freshly baked Victoria sponge, both clear indicators that she had news of significance. Over tea and cake, Mrs. Danvers revealed that she had been speaking with Catherine Wells's mother, who had come to Little Ashford for the funeral arrangements. Catherine, it turned out, was not merely abroad as had been assumed, but had actually returned to the village nearly a month ago, taking lodgings in a small cottage on the far side of Ashford under an assumed name. She had been seen, Mrs. Danvers said with significant emphasis, walking in the direction of Meadow Lane on several occasions during the past few weeks. Moreover, Catherine's mother had mentioned, quite by accident, that her daughter had recently come into money, enough to allow her to live quite comfortably without working, and that she had seemed both relieved and deeply troubled by whatever transpired. Miss Marple listened to this account with great interest, her needles pausing mid-stitch. She then asked, with what seemed to be casual curiosity, whether Catherine's mother had any idea what had caused her daughter to leave Ashford in the first place, and whether she knew if Catherine had maintained any contact with anyone in the village during her absence. Mrs. Danvers didn't know precisely, but she had gathered from Catherine's mother that there had been some sort of scandal involving a gentleman at the bank, and that Catherine had felt she had no choice but to leave her position and disappear. The scandal had apparently been serious enough that Catherine's mother had been reluctant to specify the details, but there had been implications of impropriety and a suggestion that Catherine had been treated quite unfairly by the gentleman in question. After Mrs. Danvers had departed, satisfied with having imparted her information and acquired Miss Marple's promise to join her for bridge on Thursday evening, Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts and her cooling tea. The picture that was emerging was becoming increasingly complex, and she found herself thinking about the flattened path in Meadow Lane, about the way Eleanor Whitmore had described it, and about what it suggested regarding the nature of the confrontation that had occurred there. A person fleeing would indeed flatten the path in such a manner, running in desperation. But so too would a person pursuing, and the distinction between those two scenarios was perhaps the most crucial distinction in the entire matter. She rose from her chair and gathered her outdoor things, a decision having formed in her mind about what she needed to do next. If Catherine Wells had indeed returned to the village, then she needed to understand why, and what connection, if any, existed between her return and the murder of Thomas Blackwell. The village, meanwhile, continued about its business with the satisfied air of people who believed the worst was over, that justice was being served, and that the matter could now be left to the proper authorities. P.C. Mitchell had taken David to the county town for formal questioning, and Inspector Graves had remained behind to gather additional evidence and conduct further interviews with potential witnesses. But as Miss Marple made her way along the familiar lanes toward the address that Mrs. Danvers had provided, she found herself thinking about how often the obvious solution proved to be merely the convenient one, how readily people grasped at explanations that satisfied their preconceptions, and how frequently the truth lay hidden beneath layers of assumption and social expectation. The cottage where Catherine Wells had taken lodgings was a small stone structure situated on the periphery of Ashford's proper boundaries, the sort of place that seemed to exist in a state of gentle disrepair, as though it had resigned itself to the inevitability of its own decay. Miss Marple approached it with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere particular to be, and all the time in the world to get there, her walking stick tapping softly against the gravel path. She had taken the precaution of bringing with her a small basket of vegetables from her garden, a pretext so thoroughly innocent and so entirely characteristic of village visiting that no one would have thought it remarkable. The woman who answered her knock was slighter than Miss Marple had expected, with delicate features and the kind of beauty that comes from fragility rather than strength, the sort of beauty that makes men feel protective and important. Catherine Wells regarded the elderly visitor with surprise, and something that might have been wariness, but she stepped aside and invited her in with the politeness of someone who understood that refusing would be more remarkable than accepting. The cottage's interior was surprisingly neat, decorated with care that suggested someone trying to impose order on their circumstances, and there were books everywhere, volumes of poetry and philosophy, the kind of reading that suggested an interior life of some complexity. Miss Marple settled herself into the offered chair with gratitude and began, very gradually, to establish the sort of conversational rhythms that often led to confidences. She spoke about the village and its changes, about the surprising return of people to places they had left, about the way that sometimes circumstances forced individuals to make decisions that seemed impossible at the time but later proved to be necessary. Catherine listened without speaking, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the window where the afternoon light was beginning to shift. After what seemed like a very long time indeed, Catherine said quietly that yes, she had left the village because she had felt she had no choice, and yes, she had recently returned because circumstances had changed in a way that made her return possible. When Miss Marple inquired, with the gentle curiosity of someone genuinely interested rather than merely probing, what sort of circumstances might prompt such a difficult decision, Catherine's composure wavered slightly. She stood and walked to the window, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She explained that she had become involved with a man who held a position of authority at the bank, a man who had promised her things that he had no intention of delivering. When she had discovered that he had no intention of leaving his wife, and when she had realized that she was being treated as a temporary convenience rather than a woman of worth, she had done the only thing she could do. She had disappeared. But she had also, and this was the crucial point, taken with her certain documents that proved the man in question had been embezzling funds from the bank for years, padding the accounts with false entries, and directing substantial sums into private accounts that she had discovered quite by accident while searching his desk one evening. She had left the village with these documents and had lived abroad while deciding what to do with them. When her mother's health had begun to deteriorate, however, she had determined that she could no longer remain away, and she had returned to the village, intent on retrieving her mother and leaving again. But the documents had complicated matters considerably. Miss Marple listened to this account with the expression of someone hearing a story that confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. She then asked, with precision that belied the conversational tone she employed, whether Catherine had been in contact with Thomas Blackwell since her return to the village, and whether Blackwell had been aware that she possessed these documents. Catherine's face went very pale, and her hand trembled as it moved to her throat. She admitted, finally, that yes, Blackwell had somehow discovered that she had returned, and yes, he had confronted her, demanding that she return the documents or face the consequences. He had suggested that if she did not comply, he would ensure that she was prosecuted for theft, regardless of whether his own crimes would subsequently be exposed. Catherine had refused, stating that she intended to turn the documents over to the authorities and that his threats meant nothing to her. This confrontation had occurred, she said quietly, on the very evening that Blackwell had been murdered, in a lane quite near to where his body had been found. When Miss Marple inquired what had happened after this confrontation, Catherine explained that she had left Blackwell in the lane and walked away, leaving him alive, though certainly angry and desperate. She had not heard until the following morning that he had been killed, and she had lived in fear ever since that she would be blamed, that her return to the village would be discovered, and that her possession of the documents would be interpreted as motive. Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care and regarded the young woman with an expression of profound sympathy. She then explained, in the gentle but direct manner she employed when clarity was necessary, that while Catherine's situation was indeed complicated, her account raised several questions that would need to be addressed. First and foremost, someone else had clearly encountered Blackwell in Meadow Lane after Catherine had left him, someone who had been considerably more violent in their response to whatever confrontation had occurred. Second, the inspector currently investigating the crime had arrived at conclusions that were entirely convenient, but quite possibly entirely wrong. And third, there were certain details about the evening's events that suggested a complexity of motive that extended well beyond David Thornbury's youthful indiscretion. Catherine needed to come forward, Miss Marple said, not because she had committed the crime, but because her testimony would help expose the person who actually had, and because remaining silent was only ensuring that an innocent young man would be convicted of a crime he did not commit. Catherine Wells agreed to Miss Marple's suggestion with the relief of someone who has carried a burden too heavy for her shoulders and has finally found someone capable of helping her set it down. She gathered the documents that she had kept hidden in a small leather case beneath a loose floorboard. Documents that did indeed reveal the systematic embezzlement that had been occurring at Ashford's bank for nearly 5 years, sums so substantial that they suggested not mere personal greed, but something far more calculated and deliberate. Together, Miss Marple and Catherine made their way to the police station in the neighboring town, where Inspector Graves was in the midst of conducting his interrogation of David Thornbury. The inspector's initial reaction to Catherine's appearance and her account was one of visible irritation, the kind of irritation that comes when the neatly arranged pieces of an investigation suddenly scatter across the table and require to be reassembled entirely. However, the documents Catherine produced had the effect of commanding immediate attention, and within the hour the focus of the investigation had shifted dramatically from David Thornbury's alleged guilt to a far more complex picture of financial crime, blackmail, and the kinds of secrets that small communities often harbor beneath their veneer of respectability. Inspector Graves listened with growing comprehension as Catherine detailed her relationship with Blackwell, the embezzlement scheme she had discovered, and the confrontation in Meadow Lane. He then turned his attention to Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he was only just beginning to understand that the elderly woman, who had appeared so peripheral to his investigation, might actually possess insights that his professional experience had failed to uncover. Miss Marple, for her part, simply folded her hands in her lap and suggested, in her characteristically quiet manner, that the inspector might wish to investigate the precise timeline of events on the evening of the murder with somewhat greater attention to detail than had previously been devoted to the matter. She noted in particular that several individuals the village had access to the information that Catherine had returned, and that several individuals possessed motives that extended considerably beyond the obvious ones that had already been identified. The inspector released David Thornbury immediately and apologized for the arrest with the stiff awkwardness of a man unused to admitting error. He then set about, with considerably greater thoroughness, investigating the movements and circumstances of the other individuals who had been present at the scene or who possessed knowledge of Blackwell's crimes. What emerged from this more careful investigation was a picture of considerable complexity. It appeared that Eleanor Whitmore, the former schoolteacher who had discovered the body, had been aware of Blackwell's embezzlement for some time. She had, years earlier, noticed discrepancies in the bank's records when she had served on the parish council's finance committee. But she had been persuaded by Blackwell to keep the matter quiet, persuaded through a combination of professional assurances and personal threats. Eleanor had carried this knowledge with her for years, allowing it to fester into a kind of quiet resentment, a conviction that she had been complicit in Blackwell's crimes through her own silence. When Catherine's return to the village had become known, and when Eleanor had realized that the documents existed that could expose everything, she had begun to consider the possibility that matters might be resolved in a way that would serve a kind of justice. It was Eleanor who had confronted Blackwell in Meadow Lane on the evening of his death. The inspector's further inquiries revealed that Eleanor had actually followed Blackwell from the village, having observed his meeting with Catherine and having subsequently observed his agitated state. She had pursued him into the lane with the intent of finally speaking to him about the embezzlement, of forcing him to acknowledge what he had done and to face the consequences of his actions. What had begun as a conversation had escalated into something far more heated when Blackwell had laughed at her, had dismissed her as a foolish old woman who had allowed herself to become complicit in his schemes, and had suggested that even if the documents were exposed, his lawyers would ensure that Eleanor herself faced legal consequences for her silence. In that moment, Eleanor had acted with a violence that surprised even herself, striking Blackwell repeatedly with a walking stick that she carried with her, a stick that the police subsequently recovered from the stream where she had thrown it in, an attempt to dispose of the evidence. What had motivated Eleanor, when the inspector finally sat down with her and extracted the full account, was not greed or personal animosity, but a sense of moral failure, a conviction that she had allowed herself to be corrupted by her own cowardice and complicity. Blackwell's contemptuous dismissal of her, his refusal to acknowledge the moral weight of what he had done, had finally broken something in her that years of silence had damaged. Eleanor had not intended to kill him, she insisted, but neither had she regretted the outcome once it was done. The village reacted to Eleanor's arrest with the shock that comes when an assumption about someone proves to be fundamentally incorrect. Eleanor Whitmore, respected member of the community, beloved former teacher, had murdered the village's most prominent businessman, and in doing so had become the very thing she had always claimed to despise, a person who had allowed violence to substitute for the difficult work of justice and accountability. The news of Eleanor Whitmore's arrest spread through Little Ashford with the force of a small earthquake, disrupting the comfort. Tables certainties upon which the village had constructed its understanding of itself and its inhabitants. Those who had spent the previous days discussing David Thornbury's obvious guilt now found themselves forced to reconsider not merely the facts of the case, but their own capacity for judgment and their willingness to condemn based on appearance and circumstance rather than evidence. Miss Marple, observing these shifts in village sentiment with the careful attention she had always brought to human nature, recognized in the reactions of her neighbors the fundamental truth that had motivated Eleanor's crime in the first place, the terrible certainty that people were willing to ignore evidence of wrongdoing if that wrongdoing was committed by someone they respected or someone whose crimes seemed distant from their own lives. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on the following afternoon, his demeanor considerably less authoritative than it had been during his initial investigation. He sat in her small parlor, surrounded by the comfortable accumulation of decades of careful living, and asked her directly how she had arrived at her conclusions when all the more obvious evidence had pointed toward David Thornbury's guilt. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the inspector with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for this particular question and was not entirely surprised by its arrival. She explained, in her characteristically methodical manner, that the flattened path in Meadow Lane had revealed itself to her as the key to understanding what had actually transpired. A young man fleeing from confrontation, she noted, would have run with the desperate energy of someone afraid of what he had done or afraid of being blamed for something he had not. His footmarks would have been irregular, scattered, the gait of someone in genuine panic. But Eleanor Whitmore, a woman of considerable physical strength despite her age, a woman accustomed to walking long distances and maintaining her composure, would have moved with purpose and control. Her footmarks would have been those of someone walking toward a confrontation rather than away from one. Moreover, the blood pattern that Eleanor had described discovering, the way it had been distributed across the hedgerow, suggested that Blackwell had been struck while attempting to flee or while facing someone he did not initially perceive as a threat. A young man, even one as desperate as David Thornbury had appeared to be, would have provoked a different kind of confrontation. Miss Marple then noted that Eleanor's behavior in the days following the murder had been entirely consistent with someone who had committed a crime, not from malice, but from a moment of overwhelming moral clarity combined with accumulated rage. She had seemed not guilty in the way that perpetrators of calculated crimes often did, but rather relieved, as though a burden of years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Her energetic participation in the discovery of the body and her careful attention to the details of what she claimed to have found had not been the behavior of someone trying to conceal her involvement, but rather of someone trying to ensure that the crime would be properly investigated. When Miss Marple had suggested to Catherine Wells that someone else had encountered Blackwell after Catherine had left him, she had been thinking not of a subsequent stranger, but of someone who had been watching, someone who had known about the confrontation and had followed Blackwell with intent. Only Eleanor possessed that combination of knowledge, motive, and the physical capacity to have done what had been done. The inspector listened to this explanation with the careful attention of someone. Learning a lesson that his professional training had failed to provide, and when he rose to leave, he paused at the door and acknowledged that Miss Marple's understanding of human nature and behavior appeared to exceed his own professional experience considerably. After he had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor and allowed herself a moment of reflection on the nature of justice and the ways in which it so often proved to be complicated and morally ambiguous. Eleanor Whitmore had committed murder. That was indisputable, but the murder had not emerged from evil intentions but from a combination of moral failure and a final desperate assertion of moral principle. The embezzlement that Blackwell had perpetrated had harmed not merely the bank but the entire community, had enriched him at the expense of honest people's livelihoods and savings. Eleanor's years of silence had made her complicit in that crime, and when she had finally acted, she had acted not to save herself but to force an acknowledgement of what had been done. This did not excuse the violence, Miss Marple understood, but it contextualized it in a way that suggested the world was considerably more morally complex than the simple categories of guilt and innocence that the legal system employed. Catherine Wells, having given her testimony and having turned over the documents that would form the basis for criminal charges against Blackwell's estate and the various parties who had facilitated his embezzlement, prepared to leave the village once again. Before her departure, she visited Miss Marple and expressed her gratitude for the intervention that had saved David Thornbury from conviction and had brought the truth to light. Miss Marple accepted this gratitude with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to doing what seemed necessary without requiring acknowledgement, and she offered Catherine the OBS. Ovation that the young woman had displayed considerable courage in returning to the village, despite the risks, and in being willing to speak the truth, even when silence would have been considerably safer. As Catherine left the cottage, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, and to the solitary contemplation that had always been her primary pleasure. Knowing that the village would eventually settle into a new version of itself, one that incorporated the knowledge of Eleanor's crime and Blackwell's embezzlement into its collective understanding of who it was and what values it truly held. The trial of Eleanor Whitmore took place in the county court some 3 months after her arrest, a proceeding that drew considerable attention from the regional newspapers and from the public, who found in the case a narrative that contained all the elements of genuine tragedy without the comfortable distance that fictional crime provided. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the morning that Eleanor entered, walking with the same composed dignity that had characterized her throughout her years as a schoolteacher, her gray hair perfectly arranged, her clothing modest and appropriate. Miss Marple attended the trial on the second day, sitting quietly in the public gallery with her knitting needles and her ball of gray wool, observing not merely the proceedings but the reactions of those around her, the subtle shifts in expression that revealed how people were processing the evidence being presented. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough, presenting the physical evidence that connected Eleanor to the crime, the walking stick recovered from the stream, the blood upon her clothing that she had failed to completely remove, the testimony of several witnesses who had observed her leaving her cottage at approximately the time of the murder. The defense attempted to frame Eleanor's actions as a momentary loss of control, a temporary insanity, brought on by the shock of confronting years of moral complicity and the deliberate mockery that Blackwell had directed toward her. Eleanor's own testimony was perhaps the most compelling moment of the trial. She stood in the witness box and spoke with extraordinary clarity about her years of silence, about the way that knowledge of wrongdoing had slowly corrupted her sense of self, about the moment in Meadow Lane when Blackwell had laughed at her and had suggested that she was complicit in his crimes not merely through her silence, but through her own moral weakness. She described the confrontation with neither excuse nor embellishment, and when asked by her barrister whether she regretted her actions, she paused for a long moment before responding that she regretted the necessity that had driven her to them, but she did not regret the assertion of principle that had finally broken her years of silence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty, though with a strong recommendation for mercy. The judge, in sentencing Eleanor to 10 years' imprisonment, acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of the case and suggested that Eleanor's actions, while inexcusable, had been motivated by something other than malice or personal gain. It was a sentence that satisfied no one completely, but that reflected the genuine moral complexity of the situation. After the trial concluded, Miss Marple made her way to the prison to visit Eleanor, an action that surprised many in the village, but that seemed entirely natural to those who understood Miss Marple's understanding of human nature, and her belief that conscience and principle were not diminished by transgression, but rather rendered more complicated and more worthy of examination. Eleanor greeted her visitor with a kind of weary gratitude, acknowledging that the outcome, while severe, had provided her with a kind of clarity that she had not possessed before. She spoke about her years as a teacher, and about the responsibility that came with influencing young minds, about the way that her own failure of nerve in the face of Blackwell's crimes had represented a betrayal of everything she had tried to teach her students about the importance of truth and accountability. Prison, she suggested, was perhaps a fitting consequence for that betrayal, though she had come to believe that the real punishment had been the years of silent complicity itself. Miss Marple listened to this reflection with the careful attention she had always brought to the matter, and before she departed, she offered Eleanor the observation that human nature was far more complex than the simple categories of guilt and innocence that society employed, and that Eleanor's understanding of her own failure, her willingness to acknowledge it rather than justify it, suggested a kind of moral courage that extended beyond the moment of violence itself. In the weeks following the trial, the village of Little Ashford began the slow process of reassimilating the knowledge of what had happened within its borders and within the consciousness of those who called it home. The bank underwent new management and new oversight procedures designed to prevent future embezzlement. David Thornbury, having been exonerated, found that his previous reputation had been somewhat restored, though certain villagers continued to regard him with the lingering suspicion that comes from having once suspected him of murder. Mrs. Danvers continued to spread gossip with her customary enthusiasm, though now her gossip carried a new edge, a recognition that the comfortable certainties upon which village life had rested were considerably more fragile than anyone had previously believed. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and to her customary routines, spending her days reading and knitting and observing the small dramas that continued to unfold in the village with the patient attention that had always characterized her approach to understanding the world. She received several visitors who came ostensibly to discuss the trial, but actually to seek her insights into the human motivations that had driven Eleanor to commit murder, and to all of them she offered much the same response, that the human heart was capable of extraordinary complexity, that principle and violence could coexist in ways that challenged simple moral categories, and that the greatest danger to communities came not from the crimes that were discovered, but from the crimes that were concealed, and from the moral compromises that accumulated in silence until they finally exploded into violence. The autumn of that year brought unexpected developments that seemed to ripple outward from the crime in ways that no one could have entirely anticipated. The bank, under investigation for its role in facilitating Blackwell's embezzlement, underwent a thorough audit that revealed the extent of the financial irregularities had been even more substantial than the initial discovery of Catherine Wells's documents had suggested. Several board members who had either known about or willfully ignored the embezzlement found themselves facing legal consequences, and the entire financial structure of the village, which had depended upon the bank's apparent stability and respectability, was forced to reorganize itself in ways that altered long-established patterns of influence and authority. Miss Marple observed these secondary consequences of the murder with the kind of quiet recognition that came from understanding that violence and crime were never truly isolated events, but rather elements of a complex social fabric that extended far beyond the individual perpetrator and victim. She was taking her afternoon tea when the vicar's wife arrived at her cottage with news that seemed, at first glance, entirely unrelated to the events of the previous months. Mrs. Danvers explained, with barely concealed satisfaction, that Robert Sinclair, the current husband of Margaret Blackwell, had been discovered to have been involved in the embezzlement scheme as well. He had, it appeared, been the primary conduit through which Blackwell had transferred the embezzled funds into offshore accounts, and in exchange for his complicity, he had received a substantial portion of the stolen money. Margaret Blackwell, upon discovering this information, had initiated divorce proceedings and had demanded the return of all funds that her husband had obtained through his criminal activities. This revelation created a secondary scandal that extended well beyond the boundaries of Little Ashford and into the neighboring towns and villages, and it suggested that the financial crime of which Blackwell had been guilty was far more extensive and far more deliberately orchestrated than anyone had initially understood. More significantly, it raised questions about whether Robert Sinclair's confrontation with Blackwell at the public house, the confrontation that had been mentioned early in the investigation, might have involved more than personal animosity. Miss Marple found herself considering whether the timing of Eleanor's discovery of Blackwell in Meadow Lane had been entirely coincidental, or whether there might have been other individuals moving through the village that evening with intentions and knowledge of their own. She requested an interview with Inspector Graves, who arrived at her cottage with the now familiar expression of someone Ho had learned to take Miss Marple's intuitions seriously. She posed to him a series of questions about the events of the evening of the murder, particularly about Robert Sinclair's movements and about whether he had been investigated regarding his potential presence in or near Meadow Lane. The inspector's response suggested that while Sinclair had been questioned, His involvement had seemed secondary to the more obvious guilt of Eleanor Whitmore, and his account of his movements had not been subjected to the kind of rigorous scrutiny that might have revealed inconsistencies. Miss Marple suggested gently but with considerable precision that the inspector might wish to revisit that investigation with greater attention to detail. What emerged from this renewed inquiry was a picture of even greater moral complexity than the case had previously revealed. Robert Sinclair had indeed been in the vicinity of Meadow Lane on the evening of the murder, and he had encountered both Catherine Wells and, subsequently, Eleanor Whitmore in the vicinity of the confrontation between Eleanor and Blackwell. Sinclair had actually witnessed Eleanor striking Blackwell with her walking stick, and he had chosen not to intervene or to reveal this knowledge to the authorities. His silence had been motivated not by complicity in Eleanor's crime, but by his own desire to protect himself from the consequences of his own involvement in the embezzlement scheme. He had reasoned, with the kind of twisted logic that self-interest often employs, that allowing Eleanor to be convicted would serve his purposes far better than revealing his own presence at the scene and thereby risking scrutiny of his activities. However, the discovery of his offshore accounts and his financial involvement in Blackwell's crimes had rendered this calculation moot, and in exchange for immunity regarding the embezzlement charge, he had finally revealed what he had witnessed. This discovery did not alter Eleanor's guilt or the validity of her conviction, but it suggested that the evening in Meadow Lane had been even more crowded with hidden observers and concealed knowledge than anyone had previously recognized. It also raised profound questions about the nature of complicity and silence, about the ways in which people became entangled in crimes not necessarily through direct participation, but through their willingness to ignore what they had witnessed and to prioritize their own interests above the interests of justice. Miss Marple reflected upon these revelations with a kind of deep thoughtfulness that characterized her approach to understanding human nature. She recognized in the case a demonstration of how easily moral failure accumulated, how silence bred further silence, and how the pursuit of truth required not merely the exposure of crimes, but the willingness to examine one's own complicity in allowing those crimes to persist. Eleanor Whitmore, sitting in her prison cell, would eventually learn of Robert Sinclair's testimony and his confession regarding his knowledge of the events in Meadow Lane. When Miss Marple visited her again, Eleanor expressed neither surprise nor additional bitterness at this revelation, suggesting instead that she had come to understand that the world was far more complicated than simple narratives of guilt and innocence could accommodate, and that the real tragedy was not any individual crime, but the accumulated moral failures that preceded and enabled those crimes. Winter arrived in Little Ashford with the kind of quiet deliberation that suggested even the seasons understood the weight of what had transpired during the preceding months. The bare branches of the trees that lined the village streets seemed to frame the emptiness that had been left by the departure of those whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the events surrounding Thomas Blackwell's death. Catherine Wells had finally left the village, taking her mother with her to a quiet cottage in the Cotswolds, where she could begin the slow work of rebuilding a life that had been disrupted by Blackwell's predatory attention and his subsequent death. David Thornbury, though exonerated, had chosen to remain in the neighboring town rather than return to Little Ashford, suggesting that certain violations of trust, once committed, left marks that could not easily be erased by the revelation of truth. The village had begun to settle into a new equilibrium, though one considerably different from the comfortable certainties that had characterized it before Eleanor Whitmore had struck Thomas Blackwell in Meadow Lane. It was during this period of reordering that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, a woman of approximately her own age, dressed in the kind of severe mourning garb that suggested recent and significant loss. The woman introduced herself as Helen Ashford, Blackwell's sister, and explained that she had come to Little Ashford to settle certain matters related to her brother's estate and to attempt to understand the circumstances that had led to his death and the subsequent revelations about his crimes. Miss Marple invited her visitor to sit and offered tea, recognizing in Helen Ashford's demeanor the kind of careful composure that often masked profound emotional turmoil. Helen explained that she had been estranged from her brother for many years, having discovered when she was younger that he had embezzled money from a family business in which she had held a minor partnership, and having been persuaded by their parents to remain silent about the matter. This early crime had set the pattern for the rest of Blackwell's life, and Helen had spent decades carrying the knowledge of her own complicity in his subsequent criminal activities. She had come to Little Ashford, she explained, because she believed that understanding the circumstances of his death might provide her with some form of resolution regarding her own moral failure. Miss Marple listened to this account with her customary attention, and she found herself reflecting upon the recurring pattern that emerged from nearly every aspect of the case, the way that silence enabled crime, that complicity accumulated through inaction, and that moral failure propagated itself through families and communities in ways that affected generations. She posed a series of gentle questions to Helen Ashford regarding her brother's early life, his relationships with his family members, and the particular events that had shaped his character and his choices. From Helen's responses, a picture emerged of a man who had been shaped by privilege and enabled by family indulgence, who had learned early that transgression could be concealed through a combination of social position and the silence of those who knew of his crimes. His embezzlement from the family business, committed when he was barely 20 years old, had gone unpunished and unreported, setting a precedent that he had followed throughout his life. Helen acknowledged that she and her parents had failed her brother, not by punishing him, but by allowing him to believe that his actions had no consequences, that his social position and his family connections would protect him from accountability. In failing to hold him responsible for his early crime, they had perhaps enabled the decades of subsequent embezzlement and the personal betrayals that had characterized his adult life. Miss Marple made an observation that seemed to crystallize the entire moral architecture of the case. She noted that Eleanor Whitmore's murder of Thomas Blackwell, while inexcusable in its violence, had at least represented a final assertion of the principle that actions must have consequences, that moral failures cannot be indefinitely ignored, and that truth must eventually be confronted rather than concealed. Eleanor's crime, violent though it was, had been motivated by recognition that Blackwell's crimes could no longer be tolerated in silence, and in this respect, it had been far more moral in its intent than the decades of silence that had preceded it. Helen Ashford listened to this observation with evident discomfort, but she acknowledged its validity. She then explained the actual purpose of her visit beyond mere understanding. She had come to offer a substantial financial settlement to those individuals and institutions that her brother's embezzlement had harmed, and she was establishing a foundation in Eleanor Whitmore's name that would support programs related to financial transparency and ethical accountability in small communities. In doing this, Helen was attempting not to absolve herself of her own complicity, but rather to acknowledge it and to attempt to channel it into something constructive. Miss Marple regarded Helen Ashford with considerable respect as she listened to these plans, recognizing in the woman's actions a genuine attempt to grapple with the moral complexity of the situation and to use her position and resources to promote accountability rather than concealment. Before Helen departed, Miss Marple offered her a final observation. She suggested that the real legacy of the events in Little Ashford was not the murder itself, but the revelation of how communities perpetuated injustice through silence, how privilege protected crimes from accountability, and how the assertion of moral principle, even when it took violent form, could serve as a catalyst for genuine change. Eleanor Whitmore, sitting in her prison cell, would eventually learn of the foundation established in her name and of Helen Ashford's efforts to address the systemic failures that her brother's crimes had revealed. When Miss Marple visited her again and shared this information, Eleanor wept, not from bitterness or regret, but from a kind of profound gratitude that her crime, however indefensible, had at least served as a catalyst for genuine moral reckoning within the community that had enabled Blackwell's crimes through its own silence and complicity. Spring came to Little Ashford with the kind of tentative hope that characterizes renewal in small communities, though the hopeful green of new growth seemed to many residents to carry with it a weight of memory and moral reckoning that had not previously burdened the season. The village had undergone changes that would persist, long after the immediate aftermath of Thomas Blackwell's murder had faded into local history and village gossip. The bank, under new management and substantially diminished in both size and influence, had become less a center of village power and more simply a practical necessity for financial transactions. The Ashford Foundation, established by Helen Blackwell in the months following her brother's death, had begun distributing funds to support initiatives related to ethical governance and financial transparency, creating something that might charitably be described as a kind of redemptive purpose drawn from the ashes of systemic failure. It was on a particularly mild afternoon in April that Miss Marple received the visit she had, in some sense, been expecting and waiting for, with the kind of patient certainty that characterized her approach to understanding how communities process trauma and transformation. Inspector Graves arrived at her cottage with the air of a man who had come to terms with certain truths about his own professional limitations, and who had developed a grudging respect for insights that extended beyond the scope of formal investigative technique. He had come, he explained, to discuss a matter of some delicacy involving the case and its resolution. He wished to know whether Miss Marple believed that Eleanor Whitmore's conviction and imprisonment truly represented justice, or whether it represented merely the formal machinery of law operating upon circumstances that were far more morally ambiguous than the law itself could adequately address. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the inspector with an expression that suggested she had anticipated precisely this question and had been formulating her response for some considerable time. She explained that justice and law, while related, were not identical concepts, and that the law served primarily to establish consequences for transgression rather than to determine absolute moral truth. Eleanor Whitmore had indeed committed murder, and the law had rightly convicted her and imposed a sentence that reflected the severity of her transgression. However, the circumstances that had motivated her crime, the decades of moral failure that had preceded it, and the systemic failures of the community that had enabled Blackwell's crimes all remained beyond the law's capacity to fully address or to properly condemn. True justice would require not merely the punishment of Eleanor Whitmore, but the acknowledgement of the community's own complicity in the failures that had driven her to violence. The inspector listened to this response with evident thoughtfulness, and he then posed a second question that seemed to cut to the heart of what had troubled him since Eleanor's conviction. If Miss Marple had possessed the authority to do so, would she have recommended leniency, or would she have supported the sentence that Eleanor had received? Miss Marple paused before responding, her fingers resuming their work with the knitting needles as she formulated her answer with considerable care. She suggested that leniency, while perhaps morally defensible given the extraordinary circumstances of the case, would have represented an abdication of the law's responsibility to establish consequences for violent transgression. Eleanor had murdered another human being, and while her motivation had been rooted in moral principle rather than malice, the violence itself could not be excused or minimized. However, she continued, the sentence Eleanor had received, 10 years' imprisonment, carried with it an implicit acknowledgement that her crime, while indefensible, had been motivated by something other than simple criminality. The sentence represented a kind of balance between the law's need to punish transgression and the reality of Eleanor's genuine moral convictions. In this respect, the judicial system, while imperfect, had actually managed to produce an outcome that reflected the genuine moral complexity of the situation with a precision that might have seemed impossible at the case's inception. The inspector rose to leave, and as he moved toward the door, he paused and offered Miss Marple an observation of his own. He noted that his years of professional experience had taught him to value evidence and physical fact, but the events in Little Ashford had demonstrated that the most important truths about human behavior were often invisible to formal investigation, and could only be perceived by someone possessed of profound understanding of human nature and its countless variations. Miss Marple received this acknowledgement with the grace of someone who had never doubted the validity of her own insights, but who appreciated the recognition from those whose professional training had initially led them toward DI. Front conclusions. After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting needles still moving with their characteristic rhythm, and she allowed her mind to wander through the landscape of the case as it had unfolded from the murder in Meadow Lane through the various revelations and secondary consequences that had followed. She recognized in the entire sequence of events a kind of narrative structure that suggested the human heart operated according to principles that were almost as orderly and predictable as the laws of natural philosophy, provided one possessed the patience and the attention necessary to perceive them. Eleanor Whitmore remained in prison, serving her sentence with the kind of quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout her life, and she had become something of a symbol within the penal system for the possibility of genuine moral growth and understanding, even within circumstances of profound transgression. Miss Marple's occasional visits to Eleanor had become less frequent as time had passed, but when she did visit, the conversations between them carried a weight of mutual understanding that transcended the bars and the institutional setting in which they occurred. Eleanor had come to accept not merely the fact of her punishment, but its justice, and in doing so she had achieved a kind of peace that few people were privileged to attain. The autumn that followed Eleanor Whitmore's third year of imprisonment brought with it a peculiar sense of finality, as though the village had at last completed the work of assimilating the knowledge of what had occurred and had begun to construct a new version of itself from the fragments of what had been destroyed. Miss Marple, now in her 83rd year, found herself reflecting with increasing frequency upon the nature of the case and its implications for her understanding of human behavior and moral responsibility. She had, over the course of her long life, observed countless variations of human transgression and moral failure, but the events in Little Ashford seemed to her to encapsulate something fundamental about the ways in which communities perpetuated injustice through silence and enabled crime through the unwillingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. The village had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The bank remained, but it had been thoroughly reformed under new management and the oversight of external auditors whose presence suggested a permanent acknowledgement that institutional failure could not be remedied merely by replacing the individual who had perpetrated crimes. The foundation established by Helen Blackwell had become a significant force in the region, funding initiatives related to transparency and accountability in small communities, creating a tangible legacy from Blackwell's death that extended far beyond the boundaries of Little Ashford itself. More significantly, the village had developed a kind of collective consciousness regarding its own role in enabling Blackwell's crimes, a recognition that permeated conversations in the parish council, the church, and the various social gatherings where village business was conducted. Mrs. Danvers, the irrepressible gossip, had even begun to direct her considerable talents toward promoting discussions about ethical responsibility, rather than merely spreading salacious information about her neighbors' transgressions. It was on a clear October afternoon when Miss Marple received the news that Eleanor Whitmore had been released from prison after serving her full sentence, having been denied parole on several occasions as a consequence of her unwillingness to accept diminishment of responsibility for her actions. Eleanor had, throughout her imprisonment, maintained that, while she regretted the violence of her transgression, she did not regret the assertion of moral principle that had motivated it, and she had refused to perform the kinds of contrition that the parole board seemed to expect. Her release came not through any formal acknowledgement of her reformed character, but through the simple completion of her sentence, and she returned to Little Ashford to find that the village had, in its complicated way, prepared a kind of reconciliation for her presence. Miss Marple made arrangements to visit Eleanor at the modest cottage that had been made available through the generosity of Helen Blackwell, and she found the older woman gardening with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was approaching the work as a form of meditation and restoration. Eleanor greeted her visitor with genuine pleasure, and they settled themselves in the small garden with tea and biscuits, surrounded by the evidence of Eleanor's attempts to coax growth from soil that had been neglected for years. Eleanor spoke about her time in prison, with a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that suggested she had come to understand imprisonment not merely as punishment, but as an opportunity for genuine moral reflection and growth. She had spent her years reading extensively, engaging in philosophical discussions with other prisoners, and teaching literacy to those who lacked basic educational skills, activities that had provided her with a sense of purpose and meaning despite the physical constraints of her circumstances. She acknowledged to Miss Marple that she had changed in the years since her crime, though not in the ways that institutional rehabilitation programs typically sought. She had not become remorseful about her assertion of moral principle, but she had developed a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between principle and violence, between justice and vengeance, and between the individual's right to enforce accountability and the community's responsibility to establish systems of justice that did not require violent intervention. Miss Marple listened to this account with the deep satisfaction that comes from witnessing genuine moral growth and understanding, and she shared with Eleanor her own reflections on the case and its implications. She suggested that Eleanor's crime, while indefensible in its violence, had served a crucial function in the village's development. It had forced a confrontation with truths that would otherwise have remained concealed, and it had catalyzed the kinds of institutional and personal changes that might not otherwise have occurred. This did not excuse the murder, Miss Marple emphasized, but it contextualized it in a way that suggested Eleanor's life, even including her years of imprisonment, had not been wasted, but had served purposes that extended well beyond her individual circumstances. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Eleanor walked her to the gate of the cottage, and they paused there for a moment in the golden light of the afternoon. Eleanor expressed her gratitude for Miss Marple's role in ensuring that the truth had been revealed and that David Thornbury had been exonerated, and she suggested that she had come to understand that her crime, while terrible, had been far less damaging to the village than the decades of silence and complicity that had preceded it. Miss Marple returned to her own cottage as the afternoon light faded into evening, and she settled herself into her chair with her knitting, reflecting upon the arc of the case from its beginning in Meadow Lane to its resolution in Eleanor's garden. She had learned nothing fundamentally new about human nature. Her decades of observation had already prepared her for the complex interplay of principle and transgression, silence, and violence that had characterized the events of the past years, but she had been reminded once again that understanding human behavior required patience, attention, and a willingness to see beyond the surface of things to the deeper truths that motivated action and shaped character.